Sometimes you need a tragic loss of life to shake people out of their stupor and business as usual. So it has been with the pandemic and its effect on clinical trials. This seismic event paused all kinds of clinical trials and made the industry realize that low recruiting, slow recruiting, lack of diversity could be possibly addressed by redesigning trials from so heavily being site-centered. So let's meet our panel today who can discuss this in much more detail. So we have John Reites, CEO of Thread Research, Jodi, Akin, CEO of Hawthorne Effect, Sharon Hanlon, Head of Clinical Trial and Engagement at Bristol Squibb, and Josh Rose, VP and Global Head of Decentralized Clinical Trials at siteless. John's career includes 17 plus years leading global drug development and healthcare innovation. As president of Thread, he leads the organization to enable customers to launch, adopt, and scale virtual visits plus electronic clinical outcome assessments for their decentralized studies. Named one of the top 100 influencers in digital health, John provides expertise and execution experience in digital health strategy, remote patient research, virtual clinical trials, phase 1 through 4 clinical research, patient-reported outcomes, patient engagement, and mobile health. He's also a regular keynote speaker at global industry events, guest lecturer at Duke University on digital health innovation, and a published author. Welcome to you, John. Jodi is CEO of Hawthorne Effect. She's a healthcare executive, leader, innovator, and advisor. She has more than 25 years of experience in clinical development, scientific and regulatory strategy, management, and medtech market development. She's passionate about efficiencies in innovation and stakeholder experiences, most importantly, the patient. Jodi led seminal global clinical trials and approvals of transcatheter heart valve therapy at Edwards Lifesciences through 2014. She is a serial entrepreneur, most recently founding Hawthorne Effect, an innovative platform for revolutionizing patient follow-up. Jodi holds an undergraduate degree in foreign service from Georgetown University, master's in physiology and nursing from Pace University, New York, and holds 8 patents. Welcome to you, Jodi. Sharon is Senior Director of Clinical Trial Engagement and Enrollment at BMS. She and her team partner with patients, caregivers, patient advocacy groups, and clinical trial sites to gather insights, which when applied to clinical trial development and recruitment efforts, create a more patient and site-friendly experience. Additionally, Sharon and her team are responsible for driving R&D efforts to enhance diverse patient participation in BMS clinical trials, ensuring that its clinical trial populations reflect the patient population of the disease or condition under study. Sharon is a nurse by training and received her Master of Science in Nursing from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. Welcome to you, Sharon. And last but not least is Josh Rose with CVS Clinical Trial Services. Josh is a clinical research industry veteran with more than 20 years of experience. He leads the CTS delivery business, providing patient-first research within designated CVS Health Hub locations, the home, and virtually. Josh is also responsible for CTS strategy and partnerships. Prior to joining CVS Health, Josh was Vice President and Global Head of Strategy for the Research and Development Solution business at IQVIA, while also launching and leading its DCT and home research nursing service businesses. Josh has an MBA from Duke University and a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Illinois. Before I turn it over to the panel, I wanted to mention that the audience can put questions in the chat and John will weave them in as appropriate. Over to you, John.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks, everybody. Good to see you. Appreciate your time. As you can see, we've got a great panel of individuals that really lived through the pandemic, trying to make decentralized studies work and provide the best benefit. And so we're going to try to tackle a really big conversation and try to simplify this and cut this down to some real use cases as best as we can. So again, I think all of us agree, talking about what COVID taught us about virtual clinical trials, that's like a multi-day thing, not a 1 hour panel, but we're going to do our best to really bring that. So what we did for today as a group is we defined sort of a path to have this discussion. And so we're going to focus a little bit about what COVID and the pandemic taught us about decentralizing research from a perspective of design, a perspective of delivering or operationalizing, but also from a perspective of adoption. What does the future of DCTs look like? And so that's really what we want to do to focus our conversation today. And so Sharon, Jodi, Josh, thanks for being on the panel today. Really appreciate your time. All right, so let's jump into it. Sharon, I'm gonna call you out if you don't mind jumping in first. Let's talk about design. So I think one of the things from a pharma's perspective, what were those biggest learnings that you all learned as an organization around DCTs? And really, how have you started to change your trial design post-pandemic? What's that look like now?
Yeah, John, thank you for the question. And I guess from our perspective, COVID was certainly a catalyst. I think it was a great learning opportunity for us in terms of, how important it was to have, almost a plan in place to be able to go forward. And it really, quite honestly, forced us to shift into high gear. A lot of our activities focused on decentralizing our trials. It really kicked off a lot of effort focused on probably our most important customer, our patients, and really brought them to the center. We've as a result of COVID, we've really implemented a lot more patient-centered activities. Certainly looking at decentralized trials as an option, but even more importantly, building the patient in early enough from the design of the study to really ensure that at the end of the day, we were really addressing the needs from a patient's perspective. What do they find burdensome about a clinical trial? And some of that aligned really nicely with decentralized trials in terms of really bringing the trials to the patients and making them much more accessible to them. We've built in patient advisory activities, and particularly with a lot of our digital activities, we really started to hear from patients. What did they like or dislike as far as the way clinical trials? We showed them, designs early on, schematics of studies to really, if we were proposing particular methodologies or digital innovation tactics, what resonated with them and what really carried them forward as far as that's concerned. So it's really been a learning in terms of how to move quickly and deploy quickly to really address the needs that were so urgent as far as the pandemic and how we address things. Yeah,
I love that, Sharon. That's really helpful. Jodi, slightly different question, but around design for you. Good to see you. When you think about your organization, what did this pandemic teach you about how we should define sort of where and what data should be collected? So we sort of switch gears from what Sharon meant to this data collection piece. What have you all learned? What have you seen in that change in design?
Yeah, actually, thanks, John. And it's nice to see everyone. I'd like to actually take it a step before the pandemic. The challenge, so I've always believed that clinical trials are the bedrock of medicine. The evidence that we create in clinical trials, not only for regulatory and market approvals, but how to position a new drug device therapy in the clinical armamentarium for patients, those decisions are based in the research and in the data that we produce. So, as a veteran of architecting and designing complex clinical trials for breakthrough innovations, I've always looked at, the challenge of creating a level of evidence, but on the terms of patients. They're mutually exclusive before the pandemic. And I think what happened is, so we try to design trials that have just the right amount of evidence that's not overly burdensome, but is informative and interpretable. And then when the pandemic hit, I think it just really put a big spotlight on what were already natural challenges for many decades, which is the challenges of patients meeting the requirements that we expect of them to collect all of that data. So I know that there was a lot of discussion and debate. Well, can we dumb down the data? Not using the word dumb down, but are there different data points? Are there surrogates of data? But in the world that can we do it virtually? Can we do it with telepresence? Can we do it with patient-reported outcomes as substitutes and surrogates for what we would do in an ideal world? The world that I came from, which I call sort of complex clinical trial, always required multimodal biochemical, functional, physical data, biometrics, and imaging, multimodalities of data that, by the way, in our near future, in our lifetimes, we won't be able to avoid. What size is the tumor? Did the heart valve perform better? Those things. So, trying to change our trial designs to not have to have those answers is also not the answer. And I have examples of that where FDA did come out with guidance in the pandemic that said, okay, do your best. We know patients can't come back to the hospitals. Whatever you can send is great, until those packages went in and they were missing functional and physical and other kinds of assessments. So I think, John, what it taught us was that the problem has lived for a long time underneath the surface, which is marrying the challenge of collecting data that suffices for decisions with what it is like for the patient to be able to commit to their journey. And but we've been given permission in the pandemic to allow all of our breakthroughs in terms of trial design conduct to be accepted into the armamentarium. Yeah.
Fair. That's great, Jodi. Thanks for the thoughtful approach to that. It's definitely different perspectives we're having to take, right? Because we learn different lessons. Hey, Josh, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
Hey, so from your perspective, obviously sort of seeing this in different companies as well, what are some of the key themes that you now are seeing being applied to design that are really changing because of the impact the pandemic had? What are those sort of key themes you're seeing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And can you hear me fine, by the way?
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. So we've gone through the pandemic, and as a consequence of that, like we said, it really introduced to the industry this notion of DCTs and hybrid studies, and the fact that we can really start thinking differently about modes of clinical trial. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, our objective is really to overcome the number one challenge that we have in clinical research, which is access to patients and getting patients to participate in clinical research. Historically, I think we've always thought about patient centricity, but one of the things that I think has changed is that with DCTs and with the experience that the industry has, that we can really start elevating the way that we think about patient first as a means in order to have positive impact on clinical research. So key theme number one from a design perspective is really thinking about that patient. Jodi did a really good job talking about it, but what is it that we can do in order to make it easier for a patient to participate? It happens in other industries. In consumer electronics, it happens all the time. In retail, think about the innovations that are taking place. It's all geared towards making it easier for the participant to engage. So item number one is this notion of patient first, lowering patient burden. The second thing, which I think is really exciting, is this concept of optionality. And historically, from a patient perspective, is really only one option. It was travel to a site. But what the pandemic has taught us, what DCT and hybrid studies has taught us, is that this notion of we can think about optionality in a very seamless way in clinical research that drives towards that important data collection that Jodi was talking about, but does it in a way that's much more convenient and seamless. So optionality for a patient, whether it's at a site, whether it's at a community setting, whether it's at their home with home research nursing, or whether it's done virtually. And I think from a design perspective, bringing those in closely to the fold as real options in order to drive lowering patient burden and therefore better outcomes in research.
Yeah, that's great. No, thanks for the themes. Yeah, I think, from a thread perspective, a lot of these are consistent. I think one of the things I'd call out that, we really learned, to Sharon's point, was when you think about DCT as creating a better model to recruit people into to begin with, right? You go out and you say, hey, participants, we built this study with you in mind. We would go out because we have all these services where we connect with patients and they co-create protocols. And what was really fascinating to me is a lot of times the data would say participants would look at it and go, well, yeah, isn't that what you always do? Because their expectation is, aren't you guys doing the same thing I do with Amazon and Target and everything else? And I know it's really hard for us to hear that, but it's like you said, John, it's the reality of the world we live in. I think for us, really adapting a lot of our design models to be some of the upfront services we have around, building these protocols that matter, getting endpoints that matter, but also really co-creating, not just listening to people, but listening and developing and bouncing back with them and having an open conversation, building the better study to help entice somebody to want to enroll in and be a part of is really tricky. And I think this DCT movement and what the pandemic taught us was that people's mindset already went to a hybrid lifestyle and model. And we now have to make that shift and move faster. And I think that's really healthy. And I think we're all still learning how to do that well. Great points on design. Let's shift gears to delivery. So we think about sort of what'd you learn around and what the pandemic teach us around operationalizing these types of studies? Sharon, I want to go back to you. And maybe as you think about kind of what did the pandemic teach you and your organization about the impact on sites, really focusing on, so we think about the design, how does everything you mentioned really impact sites? How are you thinking about that? And how's the pandemic changed that for your org?
Yeah. First, can I check? Can you guys hear me okay? I know.
Hear you even better than before.
Oh,
Thank you.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Awesome. The headset worked wonders.
There you go.
Good. So, in terms of, within my team, we talk about both patients and sites. So the sites, I guess, are the other, quite honestly, pivotal members of the kind of the triad: sponsor, patient, and site. From our perspective, one of the things, these folks became, in a lot of cases, healthcare heroes during the pandemic. We heard, through our interactions with sites, they were doing double duty, in some cases pulled to other parts of the clinic or healthcare facility to take care of COVID patients. So, the one thing we learned first and foremost was their resources were thin. So we really needed to, bear them in mind as we looked for ways to, enhance or to maintain the delivery of our clinical trials. So, really ensuring that whatever approaches we take weren't necessarily transferring the burden from one to the other, and looking for balance between the interactions, certainly with the patients and the sites. Certainly working with them as far as looking for ways. I think Josh said, I like the term optionality. It certainly presented some options as far as how we could ensure both that increased access, flexibility, and certainly reducing burden on them as well as the patient. So, a lot of our efforts looked for ways to leverage tools and systems within our approach to DCT that simplified it for both. Really looking to better understand the experience and how those technologies were really going to make for a much more feasible approach for them going forward. So, just really looking for ways to simplify, through training and giving them tools, short of being able to have a one-stop solution. I think that's the other thing that we're hearing is, different sponsors are using different tools. So how do we synergize that going forward, or find ways to kind of further simplify on patients? But, just really looking for ways to kind of provide the sites as well as the patients the tools to maintain access, but also to ensure that we're continuing to bring them solutions faster and leveraging a lot of the new technology as well. So, I think,
Sharon.
Sorry.
No, I was saying well, one thing to dig into, what are some of the trends you saw when you got this feedback from sites? Like, what are some of the sort of key things that come out that would say we need to do a better job around circumventing that impact you mentioned, making sure it's more positive, less negative?
Yep. I think the same as with the patients, making them part of the process. We've looked at site advisory sorts of activities to, sit down with a panel of site representatives to gain their feedback. How are we doing? We recently did a global engagement survey where we sent out, questionnaire to them to really find out how are we doing, what are the things that we're looking to explore, particularly when it comes to technology. What are the themes that they want to see more of or they want to see less of, and in general, what are the things that make them throw up their hands and in frustration with us. So I'm really anxious for that analysis to really see where do we need to lean in one direction or another. But I think just getting their pulse periodically and really understanding what we're doing that either helps or completely drives them crazy.
Yeah, good point. Looking forward to hearing about that. And I think we can dig into that more too. Hey, Jodi, when you think about delivery and sort of what your organization was learning, what did you all learn around this model, moving a brick and mortar site model into people's homes? Can you tell us a little bit about that perspective of it?
Yeah, I think what we experienced, John, is that adage about preparation and opportunity kind of coming together, that what we had designed and prepared was a way to bring the brick and mortars to the patients, but without intermediating the sites or investigators themselves. That's sort of the underpinning of Hawthorne effect. And so the way the timing worked out here from the early days of Hawthorne and then into the pandemic is we found out it does work. It actually works. I think sites and coordinators had their hands forced a little bit because they had shelter in place and stay-at-home orders. But coming on the other side, I have multiple examples to share where an FDA phase 3 pivotal trial, highly complex trial that we supported before the pandemic, it was set up literally months before the pandemic. We got through the other side where the enrollment was completed a month early. The predecessor trial of this trial format took 18 months longer than predicted. So you can see the difference there. The retention was 99% in the trial. The predecessor trial had a 15% withdrawal rate, which is common in this certain subject matter in a certain type of trial. And then the data completeness, 97% of visits completed and complete assessments delivered. So that became, and then the real halo effect was as institutions were sitting on the platform, there was early resistance and nervousness about, is this going to take over part of our work, or are our patients going to have high quality visits, or can I delegate my authority to this sort of, extension of me? On the other side of it, there was, almost perfect score patient satisfaction, but also the site started to see, wow, I can enroll more patients from more geographies that I normally will not accept because of risk of compliance or just logistics. So we come on the other side with real clear data that it's actually working, that you can bring the brick and mortar to the patients where and when they are, not just in homes. We have examples of trailer parks and Salvation Armies and really interesting geographies. We're able to show heat maps of patients enrolled and their, where they sit in relationship to their sites. And I think without advertising, without marketing, organically the site started to realize, wow, this is wind in our sails. This is not a threat to our existence.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, and if I can, I want to dig into that a little bit because you brought up a great point, which is when we think about the patient's home or remotely, that is a wide opportunity. Can you dig in a little bit more and maybe give the audience a little bit of sense of when we think about in the home is bigger, like you mentioned, some other facets for that, maybe other opportunities or other ways people should be thinking about what a remote visit looks like and where it happens?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so many amazing examples. I'll tap on Operation Warp Speed, for example. I still remember we were supporting 3 of the trials under that umbrella. And I remember one of the hospitals in Texas wanted to enroll, and these were trials where patients were admitted with COVID and they were being randomized to treatment. So even before the vaccines. And there was a homeless person who had come through the ER and all of a sudden the light bulb went on. Well, we're on Hawthorne's platform, so we can enroll that patient. They were being discharged to a Salvation Army. And I remember the team getting the call, like, yep, that's no different. We'll deliver that service and the blood draws and everything else in that setting. Homes, it's not just home. It could be churches. It could be in a CVS hub somewhere. It could be in a Minute Clinic. It could be anywhere. It doesn't mean necessarily home. I think the word decentralized, by the way, we talk a lot about this. I think that's such a nebulous word to a patient or a participant, but to say home-based research, I think it's a term I think we're coming full circle to. We were a little, I would say, sensitive to the optic that home-based research was using home healthcare, and it was just sort of, a bolt on to the research system. So the terminology I think is really interesting, but the concept is outside of the brick and mortar setting of, where the ivory towers sit. Yeah.
Fair. Thanks, Jodi. That's great. And hey, Josh, when you think about sort of the shift to delivery, knowing you for a long time, strategic thinker, you think about the art of the possible. I hear you say that all the time. And I think it's a great way to think, right? It's how do we step back from this? How does this sort of change our perspective on how we deliver in studies, right? What do you think our industry learned about what that art of the possible actually look like when we think about operationalizing these types of models?
Yeah, I'll keep it at a relatively high level without going into the specifics at an operational on a study level. But, when we kicked off this webinar, we talked about the fact that there was a cataclysmic event that changed the way that we think about the world. And if you go back in history, think about World War II, where prior to World War II, women represented 20% of the workforce. But then, males were shifted off to the war front, and therefore women were asked to join manufacturing. And that took us from 20% participation to today, equal participation in the workforce as it is today, women and men, which is terrific. And that stayed and it lasted. 9/11, security in airports, the same kind of thing. So there's these events that happen, and then it just dramatically changes the way that we think about pandemic, hybrid studies, decentralized clinical trials, the same thing, an old normal and a new normal. But what does that mean? It means that as an industry, this concept of art of the possible, it really means that we actually can change. We can change, and change is good. I like the way that you and Sharon talked about this notion of it. It's okay to be bold. It's okay to think about transformation. And it's interesting, John and others, Sharon and Jodi, is that there's often people that think about DCT and hybrid studies as disruptive. And I'm actually not a fan of that term. I actually like the term transformative, positive, moving us in the right direction to better sites, to Sharon's point, to better patients. So first thing, this notion that we can change is good. The second thing from Art of the Possible is this notion of we can actually move fast. I think historically, pharma, more risk averse, maybe reticent to change. We're becoming much more comfortable with speed, testing things quickly in a controlled environment to make sure that we're not breaking something. But this idea of we can get there. So speed of implementation of new things is something also coming in. And the last thing I'll say in terms of implementation, when we think about DCT and hybrid, there's this misconception that it's technology. Technology plays a critically important part, but I think as we think forward, it's this careful melding of digital and physical. And be physical, I mean patient home, I mean site, I mean community site. And so this really careful melding of the digital world, critically important, along with the physical. And doing those, I think, are kind of, from a implementation perspective, something that we'll do more and more of.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Do you think, like, if you had to give a percentage, totally putting you on the spot, if you had to give a percentage of this art of the possible that we've actually realized so far in this journey to modernizing or transforming how research is done, where are we? What's the TripAdvisor score? What's the percentage look like for us so far?
It's a really good question. So today, there's around, on clinicaltrial.gov, there's around 1,000 studies running that incorporate elements of decentralized or hybrid studies. So I think we're on that. We're a little bit past the early adopters, but we're not into kind of the late majority yet. But there's definitely a groundswell in this openness from top pharma, mid pharma, and increasingly with biotechs towards being open to thinking much more differently about incorporating elements of DCT in order to drive better outcomes.
Yeah, well said. No, that's great. Appreciate that. Yeah. And, from Thread's perspective, operationalizing things, kind of to what Jodi mentioned, doing this before the pandemic, you spend time explaining to people this is how this works. And a lot of times they ask you the question, why? The biggest shift operationally for us was people stopping asking why and saying how. And then you got into the real nuts and bolts of this is a measured way to actually do this hybrid DCT or this, hybrid DCT that leans more to a medical device or whatever flavor was fit for purpose for that patient population, that study design. But I would tell you what was really key for us is really understanding that a patient-centric model was not a site-centric model, meaning that just because you're patient-centric doesn't mean you weren't thinking about sites. It meant you were thinking about patients first, designing with them and for them, but then making sure that sites input feedback in the way they operationalized it was supporting them. And so this idea of proper training and tech support and service support, like Josh was mentioning, I think is spot on because it was so key, right? Because we're not, it's not, someone said, oh, will you do the decentralized to remove these things? And I said, actually, I would tell you do decentralized to shift these things. And when you think about it from that perspective, it becomes more of an augmenter, your mindset changes. And, it's all about the data and the feedback, right? We publish this data and you say, here's where it works. And I'm encouraging everybody on the phone, we have to publish more of this data. At Thread, we're publishing data all the time to say, like, here's what works, here's where it doesn't. And that's not a reflection of if DCT works or not. It's a reflection of a lot of different data points. And what we really saw in the operationalization of this work and how to deliver it is that customers equally needed to go through a process to think through and make these decisions, and getting into those decision-making processes earlier was better. And I think Josh is 100% right on that. That's what we've seen really change post-pandemic. It's people coming in earlier saying, forget DCT design. How do I make this study patient-centric, and how can you help me do this? And that level of thinking is the shift I think we really need to make that happen.
Hey, John, I'm sorry, was somebody going to jump in? Just real quick comment on that, and one of my guest speakers wants to say, but one of the things that happened with COVID across the globe is that we've elevated and introduced the concept of clinical trials into the mainstream.
Yeah, fair.
A lot more people know about it, and they have a positive view because it led to unbelievable outcomes like COVID vaccines. We, therefore, the pharma industry, we now owe it to them to deliver on that, to be able to say, here's clinical trials, and here's a way for you to participate in a way that works for your everyday life. One of the things that we do at CVS Health is we really try to bring the community to the patient setting. So just to make it easier for them from a familiarity, comfort, lower burden. So I think the points that you're making around, we owe the industry, the market now to deliver on this concept of you're familiar with clinical trials. This is why it's easy for you to participate.
Well said.
And that's an important concept that Josh just made in terms of, kind of the market and the lens, because, one of the things in our conversations with patients, they're afraid of the rollback. You're focusing on me now. This is great. What happens when the pandemic moves into more everyday life? And, does that mean you're going back to the way you used to do it? And so, I think that's an important aspect around, maintaining balance and buy-in, quite honestly, keeping the patients and the sites at the center so that we don't lose whatever we've gained as far as, trust is always a big item that comes up, as far as a factor. So the more we can do to kind of keep the ball moving forward, still continue to reinforce that, this is about them, not necessarily, yes, it's continuing to get our products to market, but it's definitely with the patients and to your point earlier, the sites and keeping them, it's not a shift in burden one way or the other. If we do it right, it's a balance. as far as things are concerned.
I'd love to pick up on a word, Sharon, that you just mentioned, and all these comments are just amazing. I love the convergence of how leaders in the industry, by the way, I think are coming together, which I want to come back to that point in a moment. But the word you brought up, Sharon, is trust. And, the constituents, our constituents are there's a multitude. There's the patient, there's the investigator, and the investigators, delegates, the coordinators, there's the sponsor, there's the regulators, there's the consumers, of the data and of these things. So that's a lot to handle for all of us to make sure that we're building on that confidence and trust. And I do think, to Josh's point, we've passed the early adoption curve. I think there's absolutely no going back. I think it's very, very exciting for all of us that the hard work isn't, I remember I used to have 8 slides on what the problems of clinical research were. Now I don't have to say that at all to anybody ever again. And to John's point, we can talk about the how. And I think what I've learned, and my team has learned over this past, I'd say 6 months to a year, is the job's not done with just inventing, creating, and offering what we offer. It's helping our sponsors and our constituents weave in the how, right? And so I think that I would suggest that as leaders, there's a lot more collaboration and less competitiveness, that I find that we're coming together, that this is an ecosystem that we've changed, and that ecosystem has a bunch of moving parts. And instead of asking our sponsors to stitch that together, or our CROs to stitch that together, or the traditional ones, we have to help stitch it together in a way that's really cohesive. So I feel, I'm really excited about the phase that we're in right now, where we're reaching out to each other across the industry to help stitch that together, and to, from the beginning stages, starting with where are the patients, who needs to be included, then how do we build that blueprint to an accelerated and an exciting trial?
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Well, for what it's worth, we've got through design and delivery, and we're being as expeditious as we can. It still took us 40 minutes. Why? Because there's a lot that we learned, and I think that's okay. We all are scientists in our delivery. We have to be scientists in our execution and evolution. And so what I wanted to offer to everybody in the audience is we've got a little bit of time set aside for some Q&A. So if you can, I see a couple questions popping up. If you've got a question for the panel, please just submit it in the chat, and we'll grab that and use it. Now I want to shift, though, to the final section, which is how do we think about the adoption? What did we learn? What did COVID teach us about DCTs when it comes to adoption and the future of DCTs overall? And so, Sharon, if it's okay, I want to go back to you.
Sure.
And why don't you talk to us a little bit about some of the cultural and mindset changes that you really do see, but also believe need to continue to change to really drive adoption post-pandemic?
Yeah, no, thank you. And certainly from our perspective, I think our sidebar a few minutes really touched on a lot of the elements. I think first and foremost, it's really, at least from a sponsor perspective, we are slow to change, and the way we've done clinical trials has been pretty much the same way. I've been in the industry for almost 25 years, and things are, other than the movement from NCR page case report forms to ECRFs, we haven't made a whole lot of mass changes. So, certainly starting at the organizational level to really ensure buy-in, we want to be sure that, as we go through the identification process, that teams are aware of what to expect. And so, starting with our own team, I think Jodi touched on it great. I liken, there's a lot of synergies with the DCT advancement with our diversity activities. Both kind of came to, rise during the pandemic. Both, at least in my mind, similar to Jodi's, really require collaboration across pharma, as well as others in the ecosystem. I think it's going to be important for wholesale success across the board if we're working together, sharing best practices, sharing lessons learned. And at the end of the day, I think our goals are to really reach more people. Same with diversity, to really reach a diverse population, bring the trials where the patients live, and really ensure that optionality and flexibility in their ability to participate in a clinical trial. I mean, certainly the combination, to better reflect our patient population, that's a goal of our diversity activity as well. And certainly a lot of synergy with our planned, continued implementation of new and innovative approaches focused on our patients.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. That's great. Hey, Jodi, over to you. When you think about sort of the operational team, so you sort of take the overall ethos, culture, mindset, but then you drive this down to those operational teams. How do we better educate and make these approaches become easier and sort of less challenging for them? What is your advice? What are you seeing to really drive that moving forward?
It's a great question. I think that's the great challenge that we still all have, which is really mapping the relationships, mapping the roles in the ecosystem. So, for example, on the sponsor side, what is the sponsor solving for and their operational team? You'll have your ClinOps peeps that are solving for the regulatory, the GCP, the mechanisms of the study. You've got your site relationship people who are trying to navigate, these are our customers, and, how does this work with our sites? So, really drilling down to that next level of mapping the stakeholders and making sure that we sort of bring that conversation together, I think is the real piece, in terms of going to the next level of true transformation.
Yeah, that's helpful. No, it makes a lot of sense. Hey, Josh, over to you as we think about the sort of adoption future. What are some of the key strategies? What are some of the things that companies should be thinking or considering when they're thinking about bringing this all together, right? Stitching together the integrations and the support and all the things you mentioned before in the themes into sort of one adoption journey, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'll focus on a couple things. First thing, Sharon's point about no looking back for patients and for the industry, I think is a really good one, right? So patients are there. Let's continue down the journey. A lot of hard work has been accomplished, and let's continue so that we can make it better for patients. Maybe three things to think about. First thing, I hear a lot from sites about the fact that a lot of technology is being thrown at them, and as a consequence of that, I think there's a little bit of kind of throwing out the baby with a bathwater. Is technology bad? I think that the issue is that we need to make sure that as we use technology, it needs to be highly usable. You talked about it, and I'm sure that Thread does this excellently, is this notion of whether it's a site or a patient, it's highly usable. And then we're going to be able to overcome some of the antibodies to new technology. There's no question that technology is good and technology is needed, but it needs to be usable so it's not increasing burden. That's number one. Second thing, at the end of the day, it's all about data integrity. And we're using sensors, we're using alternate ways of collecting data, and that's good. Ideally, everything is seamlessly integrated, so it all comes in nicely, but reality is it's going to be a journey till we get there. So alternate means of collecting data is also good, meaning you may collect sensor data, but then if you need to import it into an EDC system, there's a separate step that you need to take, and that's okay. We don't need to wait for nirvana of everything being seamlessly integrated in order to use alternate data collection methods. The third thing I will say is just plan for backups, right? As we're going towards this movement to the future, things may not always work well, and that's okay, as long as you've thought through it and you said, I may not be able to do it this way, but there's a very logical and easy to implement backup so that it's not impacting your study. Yeah,
no, those are great. Yeah, I think there's so many, and it's great to hear these adoption lessons. I think this is what we're going to learn. If we do this panel again next year, the adoption discussion will be way more fruitful than even the first two we had. But what I would say is when you think about adoption, I think it's really interesting to me to see as customers start to progress these studies and we start to think about driving adoption, where the baseline in which we're starting the adoption journey from is different. Meaning that, some sponsors, some CROs start with, hey, for me, this decentralized study design I want to start with looks like a hybrid of e-consent, eCOA, and telehealth. For some other person, it's 37 features, like the full breadth of things with a much more decentralized flavor to it, right? Because of their patient populations, the therapeutic area they're serving. And so I think what is really important to understand is that everybody's adoption journey is actually something that is customized, right? Because every company has a different culture, as you've mentioned. Every company has a different perspective on how they want to crawl, walk, run into something. And they also have different experiences coming in. And I think what we're going to tend to see in this adoption journey is differences in not just where people start, but where people end up. And I think that's actually really healthy and really good, right? Adoption in our industry has always been differing when differing technologies or differing approaches have come out. And so I would just say, just kind of talking to a customer last week who was sort of having FOMO about, I saw this person was doing this and I went, time out. Don't worry about that. What are you trying to do for this patient population is the right thing to do. And the more we have those conversations, we start to get back to what you've all done a great job today of reminding us. It's a healthy and measured consideration of how do we be supportive of the patient and build that in and do it for those fit for purpose studies. That's the root of where I think this adoption goes. All right. So I know we only have a few minutes left. So if it's okay, I've got some questions from the chat. If you've got any other questions that you'd like to add, please throw them in. I'm going to pick a few, and I've got a few that were submitted before that I can throw in as well. But maybe, hey, Jodi, looks like this was to you from an earlier point that you had, asking about publishing metrics for the phase 3 study. So maybe, not to put you on the spot about that particular study, but is there a resource for that, or is that published somewhere? Are there other publications you would direct people to find more data on, those changes in recruitment and retention and data quality and collection?
Not yet, but yes, we're super interested. I'm all about publishing. So this is a big strategic sponsor, and I think they would be interested as well. I think in the early days, I think not to, we're on the other side of just the enrollment phase. We're going to continue to go through the longitudinal follow-up, but they have actually been publicly presenting in meetings about this story. So we're really drilling on the details, and yes, it will. We do plan to do a white paper, or at least some kind of publication. I call it the Hawthorne effect of the Hawthorne effect. You guys can make that. Yeah.
All right, that's helpful. Hey, Sharon and Josh, when you think about, if you get asked the same question about, hey, I'm looking for publicized data to back up me maybe selling this or pitching it to my teams, where do you direct people? What do you think are some solutions they should be thinking about?
In terms of, I'm just trying to.
Any resources, like if you said, hey, if someone came to you and said, I'm looking for publications like what Jodi's looking for studies that have had this type of response or this type of recruitment or retention rate, where do you direct them? Where do you say, oh, there's a publication over here and here's where you should go to learn? Or do you just say, there's not a lot of it, it's just kind of out there in pieces? What's the advice or input you give when people ask you for published data around these topics you're talking about in DCTs?
Yeah, I mean, the data is definitely growing. And from my own, I probably would start with, some of our internal experts. But certainly, there's a lot of resources that are available to us. I don't know if Josh has any other.
Yeah,
thoughts.
I'll add a little bit. So one of the things that at CVS Health, we put a lot of emphasis on, and I think, John, this kind of answers the question, is that as we're conducting studies, as we're implementing new modes, whether it's community-based recruiting, or whether it's actually conducting research in a community-based setting, we're collecting data and publishing it in the form of case studies, with a real emphasis on trying to demonstrate the change, the lift, the improvement versus standard. And so those are things that, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. It's going to be difficult often to share data. However, if you take a case study, here's some work that we did, here's the challenge, this is what was implemented, here's the metrics that demonstrate it, that is readily available and we can share that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I would just say that there's actually a wealth of publicized data. We just published some around inclusion on Nature from some studies. We had some. There's a lot of it out there. I think you see DTRA and other groups trying to pull those assets together actively in groups. So I think we'll do a better job as an industry. But to Josh's point, there is a lot out there. It's just about asking for it. Two other quick questions I want to move to. So one was, a question around talking a little bit more about supplying DCTs, and I'm going to try to step back and make sure that we get this right, but it's more around, how do we do inventory and logistics management and think about sort of, what changes in a DCT, right? Distribution of supplies, maybe distribution of drug supply or clinical supplies. How do we need to think different? How does that work differently in DCTs? I think there's some clear request from the audience for that. So anyone want to take a stab at that first?
I'll jump in, since I think we're of the logistics and in our platform. So in the Hawthorne platform, again, because we started with the complex and then went to the more virtual, if you will, our studies and our visits require, that's what we're talking about, bringing the hospital to the patient. So I'm going to give an example. We do very complex cardiovascular trials that require echo imaging. Those echo machines in a hospital are $60,000, $70,000 and up, capital equipment. What we do in every study, and it's a playbook and it's part of the platform, is what goes along with the study visit table is what are the associated data elements and what are the associated supplies and equipment that are relevant for each and every assessment, and how does that wrap up into what we call visit choreography. So if there's a patient who would naturally go back to the Cleveland Clinic, spend a full day or maybe two in follow-up, going to the echo lab, going to the blood lab, doing their functional and 6-minute walk, what we do is choreograph all that in a single and sometimes 2 visits. And what is with that is the equipment and the supply chain. So who conducts those visits are our Hawthorne heroes. They're certified and trained and readied for those visits. When they're invited to go out, they are equipped. So we manage the whole supply chain so that, and what's really important about that is not just the efficiency of logistics, but also the conformity, the compliance, and the level of consistency that can be delivered by decentralizing and that supply chain. So a hero can be doing visits in Alaska and Florida and in central Colorado. They're using the same, blood pressure cuffs, the same echo machines, the same methodologies and modalities. And that coming full circle is to deliver a high level of research. So the logistics has to be considered and it has to be controlled. And that's one example of how it can be done.
Maybe, John, I'll just give a short, another example is when at CBS, when you're conducting research in a minute clinic or at a patient's home, there still is a need for IP management. And that's where it's just a little bit different. So the same methodology of supplying IP to the end user, but in one case, if it's going to a site through kind of a central hub to your minute clinics, or through a central pharmacy to home research nurse that then takes it to the patient. It's the same logistics, but ultimately just a kind of a different way of thinking about it to adopt to this new way of optionality in research.
And it sounds like from the sponsor side, not much different. A lot of it, our assessment starts certainly before the protocol is finalized. And I think to Jodi's point around looking at the logistics, time and event schedule, and how is that going to align with our plan around the approach, making sure that the elements associated with DCT align as well. So it definitely starts before you have a final protocol. I think some teams have tried when they've already had a final protocol to, this might be a great study. Well, that's why we really like to know what's coming early, at least in the pipeline, so that we're able to align with the study team before carrying things forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I have an old expression. I used to say at the end of every study, you have a perfect protocol. So you can still adapt your way through.
Yeah, fair enough.
True.
Fair enough. All right. Well, just for time, we're coming in the home stretch here. Let me do last question for everybody. And the question was, do you have any successful collaboration examples of doing research with universities? Right. So when you think about, universities, and I'm sure that can be, one side can be sort of your intent to treat or, an actual, maybe like an ARO type design. The other could just be, working with universities deeper in a site relationship. So do you have any examples of a successful collaboration there that would be worth talking through for the audience?
Hey, John, maybe I'll just touch on I think, an exciting solution that we're working on right now. So academic medical centers, huge and important players in clinical research, often a challenge for patients, right? Based on where they're located and how difficult it is to participate. So what we're working on is this collaboration where we will use our mini clinics as a satellite web around an academic medical center, where some of the visits in a study will take place in a mini clinic, where it's a lot easier. Maybe it's for, blood draws and follow-ups, et cetera. But then for pivotal visits, biopsies, endoscopies, et cetera, they'll go to the academic medical center. But essentially this satellite model that we can embed on top of the medical center to make medical centers substantially easier and more relevant in this new environment where we're headed.
That's super cool, Josh. I love that. I have an example that Josh, it's coincidental. So first of all, before I get to the example, there is an intersection with CVS and what we're doing that was orchestrated through an ARO. I'm going to come back to that because it's super exciting. But Hawthorne sort of go-to-market stories, we started at the university level. We started by having direct contracts with universities who were in these challenges of patient follow-up or recruitment of patients. By definition, they're referral centers, your Stanfords, your Cleveland Clinics, your Mayos, so on and so forth. So we started at the university level, and that did lead to not only early adoption, but it led to being included in grant writing. We worked with Duke to win a very huge pragmatic trial with the NIH about how that intersection works. And pragmatic trials are population studies in mega studies in terms of thousands and thousands of patients. So there is definitely a leaning in from the university point of view to improve their capabilities, if you will. But fast forward, a really cool story I'd love to tell you guys about. There's a study called Preview, was launched on April 20th of this year. It's led by a university and academic research organization, CRF in New York and Columbia University, also involved is Vanderbilt and University of Michigan. And the design of this is a prevalence study to understand the incidence of heart valve disease in the wild, meaning not patients who are showing up with symptoms. This could not have been done without this sort of distributed model. CVS is the source of patients. So CVS is alerting their consumers by email or by a flyer or a mailer. They click on to learn about the study in a landing page. And then Hawthorne is a single site of record where we're enrolling patients all the way across the country to Hawaii. We've enrolled a very large number of patients. This will ultimately be a 5,000 patient study. Again, couldn't have been done without this kind of collaboration where it's direct to consumer. It's being architected and run through academia, but it's going to be a really exciting contribution to the literature in terms of what is the real incidence of heart valve disease. And I want to double click because of CVS's reach. We have identified where are the zip codes, as David Feinberg always says, our health is an intersection of our genetic code and our zip code. So we're using zip codes for the outreach to make sure that we're reaching the generalized population, where are Latinos and African Americans and so on and so forth. So I think this is a really exciting breakthrough that is being embraced both by public and universities and academic research organizations together with us innovators.
Perfect. All right. Well, with that, we covered how the pandemic changed everything in our worlds in 1 hour. No, listen. Thank you so much. It was great to see the three of you. Thanks for being on the panel. Everybody in the audience, thank you for submitting questions. Thanks for listening to us and engaging in the conversation. Again, we look forward to next time. Arnati, can I hand back to you to help wrap up our session, please?
Absolutely. Thank you to you, John. You're just a natural in moderating. I always feel that when I see you moderate. Thank you to Sharon, Jodi, and Josh. I already have ideas for stories in my head, which I'll be sending off to our reporters based on what you guys said today. So thank you very much to the audience for listening in.